Welcome back to Talk Tensors. Today we're diving into some really interesting research on making exoskeletons work better for people with spasticity.
Yeah, it's a paper looking at adaptive torque control using reinforcement learning.
Right, adaptive torque control of exoskeletons under spasticity conditions via reinforcement learning. So why is this such a big deal? I mean, exoskeletons exist, right?
They do, but spasticity throws a real wrench in the works. It's basically when muscles get unusually stiff and it's velocity dependent.
Meaning the faster you try to move, the more resistance you get.
Exactly. And that's a huge problem for controlling a robot attached to your limb.
Yeah.
Current exoskeletons, well, they often have trouble, especially if the spasticity is, more severe. Safety becomes a major concern.
Okay, so current approaches aren't quite cutting it for everyone, and this paper proposes using deep reinforcement learning.
Precisely. They're training an AI, an RL agent, to learn how to control the exoskeleton's torque, adapting to these changing spasticity conditions in real time. It's about creating something more personalized and, crucially, safer.
So less about just forcing a movement and more about working with the person's condition.
That's the goal. And a key finding they highlighted early on was that their RL controller managed to reduce the peak torque applied to the joint.
Which sounds much safer. Okay, let's get into the details. How did they actually approach this? Spasticity seems really complex to model or predict.
It is. And that's where a big part of their work comes in. They developed what they call a digital twin.
Okay, a virtual simulation.
A very sophisticated one, yeah. It combines a musculoskeletal model of an adult leg, muscles, bones, the works, with the knee exoskeleton model.
So not just the robot, but the human interaction too.
Right. And they modeled realistic coupling, like how the cuff might shift slightly, joint misalignments, soft tissue movement, things that happen in the real world. It uses 4 degrees of freedom for that connection.
Wow, okay. That sounds detailed. But what about the spasticity itself? How do you simulate that?
That's the other really clever bit. They create a differentiable model of the spastic reflexes.
Differentiable, meaning you can smoothly adjust it, like a dimmer switch.
Kind of, yeah. It allows them to simulate different levels of spasticity, corresponding roughly to the modified Ashworth scale, levels 0 to 3. They didn't include level 4, likely because it represents extreme rigidity, which poses different challenges.
Okay, so they can dial the virtual spasticity up or down. How does the model actually work?
It uses something called a spasticity coefficient, or SC. This SC depends on both the joint angle and the joint velocity, using sigmoid functions, those S-shaped curves, to model how the spasticity kicks in at certain angles or speeds.
So it captures that velocity-dependent nature we talked about.
Exactly. And they have different parameters for flexion and extension, reflecting how spasticity can affect muscles differently. They even included parameters for different MAS levels based on literature values.
And this SC value then influences the virtual muscles.
Right. It scales the force generated by the key muscles involved in knee movement. They focused on 11 main ones, grouped into flexors and extensors. So higher SC, more unwanted muscle force in the simulation.
And they even simulated different people.
Sort of. They added a bit of random noise, Gaussian noise, to the spasticity parameters for each training run. This helps the RL agent learn to handle the kind of variability you'd see between individuals.
Okay, so they have this highly realistic virtual test bed. Now, what about the reinforcement learning part? What's the agent actually trying to achieve?
The main goal is to get the exoskeleton to move the virtual knee from a 90-degree bend towards full extension, like straightening your leg.
But not just get there, right? Safety was important.
Absolutely. The reward function is key here. It rewards the agent for getting closer to the target position, yes, but it heavily penalizes high interaction forces between the exo and the leg.
So minimizing that unwanted force is baked right into the learning objective.
Exactly. There are also rewards for keeping the joint velocity low, smoother movements, and for using the exoskeleton's motor efficiently, minimizing jerky commands.
Makes sense. It's balancing performance with safety and smoothness. Which RL algorithm did they use?
They went with Soft Actor-Critic, or SAC. It's known for being quite good at exploring the possibilities in complex environments and handling continuous actions, like setting a torque value. It's suitable for these changing dynamics.
And they trained this for 50 million steps in the simulation.
Yep, a massive amount of virtual practice. During training, they kept randomizing the spasticity level and the subject parameters on each go, forcing the agent to learn a truly adaptive strategy.
Okay. And how did they evaluate it? Did they compare it to anything?
They did. They compared the trained SAC agent against a standard baseline, a PID-based compliant torque controller.
PID, that's a classic control method, right? Proportional integral derivative.
That's the one. Very common, but often needs careful tuning. They tuned their PID controller specifically for a mild spasticity level, MAS1. The idea was to see if the SAC agent could outperform this fixed controller across different spasticity levels.
So pitting the adaptive learner against the pre-tuned standard, what did the results show?
Pretty compelling stuff. Looking at how the SAC controller behaved, you could see it adjusting its torque output based on the simulated spasticity level. It generally got the knee extended, although it took longer and didn't quite reach full extension at the highest level, MAS3.
Okay, so maybe prioritizing safety over full range at high stiffness.
That seems to be the case. When they compared it directly to the PID controller, the differences were clearer. The PID controller sometimes overshot the target angle at low spasticity.
Because it was tuned for a higher level.
Potentially, yeah. And at higher spasticity levels, the PID controller often had larger final errors than the SAC agent. But the really striking difference was in the interaction torques.
The forces between the robot and the leg.
Exactly. The SAC controller consistently generated lower interaction torques across all spasticity levels. Especially at MAS3, the difference was quite noticeable.
So less force being pushed onto the user's leg. What about the overall force profile, like the peaks?
They looked at that too. They measured the RMS torque during the settling phase, basically, the average force fluctuations as the knee approached the target. While higher spasticity meant higher RMS torque overall for both controllers, the SAC agent consistently had lower RMS values for levels 0 through 2.
Quantitatively, how much lower?
On average, about an 8.9% reduction in RMS torque during settling for the SAC controller compared to PID.
Okay, nearly 9%. And the peak forces, the sudden spikes?
Also lower with SAC. They found an average reduction in the maximum interaction torque of about 10.6% across all spasticity levels.
Over 10% reduction in peak force, that sounds significant for safety and comfort.
It really does. It suggests the RL agent learned a strategy that is inherently gentler on the user's joint, especially during those moments where spasticity might cause resistance.
Interesting. Was there any difference in how the controllers themselves behaved, like the commands they sent?
Yeah, the SAC controller's raw torque commands were actually a bit noisier, more rapidly changing than the PID's smoother signal.
Oh, that doesn't sound ideal.
You might think so, but the researchers noted that the physical system, the exoskeleton, and the leg dynamics effectively filtered this out. The resulting movement was smooth, and importantly, the overall magnitude of the SAC control signal was generally lower, even though it achieved better position results in many cases.
So, more reactive commands, but ultimately less forceful and achieving better or comparable results, especially regarding safety.
That sums it up well. It really seems the SAC agent learned to prioritize keeping those interaction forces low, even if it meant not perfectly hitting the target angle in the most severe simulated cases.
Which, arguably, is the right priority for a rehabilitation or assistive device.
Absolutely. Safety first.
Now, this was all in simulation. How confident are they that this translates to the real world?
They're clear as a simulation study, which is always a limitation. But they argue that the detail of their digital twin, including those realistic coupling effects, the biomechanics significantly boosts the potential for successful transfer.
Because they tried to capture those real-world nuances from the start.
Exactly. It's not just a simple point mass simulation. They put effort into modeling the complexities of the human-robot interaction. And they've made their simulation environment code available on GitHub, which is great for reproducibility and future work.
That's good practice. It lets others build on it. So thinking about the bigger picture, how does this fit into the history of exoskeleton control?
Well, it's definitely part of a major shift. Early exoskeletons, they often used very rigid, predefined trajectories, like the robot moves along this path, period.
Which sounds terrible if you have involuntary spasms.
It could be, yeah. Dangerous even. So the field moved towards more compliant control, trying to sense the user and assist rather than dictate. But even those often relied on like impedance control or admittance control, which can be hard to tune perfectly for something as variable as spasticity.
Requires a lot of expert setup for each person.
Often, yes. And they might not adapt well if the person's condition changes day to day or even minute to minute. This RL approach represents a move towards controllers that can learn and adapt automatically. It leverages AI to handle that variability and complexity in a way that's difficult with traditional methods.
It's really tapping into the power of machine learning for personalization in robotics.
Definitely. It's about making the technology smarter and more responsive to the individual user.
Okay, so recapping the key innovations here. They used deep RL, specifically SAC, trained within a really detailed digital twin that included a novel differentiable spasticity model.
Right. And this allowed the agent to learn an adaptive torque control strategy.
And the main outcome was significantly reduced interaction forces, both peak and RMS, compared to a standard PID controller, suggesting a big improvement in safety.
Yep, potentially opening the door for using exoskeletons with individuals who have higher levels of spasticity than currently feasible.
Fantastic. All right, let's shift gears slightly to our novel notions segment. This work opens up some interesting doors. What's a potential future research direction this makes you think of?
One really exciting avenue, I think, is integrating real-time physiological data directly into the control loop.
Physiological data, you mean like signals from the body itself?
Exactly. Think about using EEG sensors to measure muscle activity, or maybe even skin conductance, which can reflect physiological arousal or stress. The current RL agent uses kinematics, joint angles, velocities.
Okay, so it reacts to the movement or the forces that result.
Right. But what if the agent could get a heads up before a big spastic contraction fully develops? By monitoring EMG, maybe it could detect the neural signals that precede the muscle tightening.
Ah, so it could potentially anticipate the spasm.
That's the idea. You could design the reward function to encourage the agent to use these physiological signals to preemptively adjust the exoskeleton's torque. Imagine it subtly relaxing its assistance just before the spasm hits, minimizing the resistance felt by the user.
Wow, like learning the user's specific pre-spasm patterns.
Precisely. It would be hyper-personalized. With wearable sensors getting better and cheaper, this feels increasingly possible. It can make the whole experience much smoother, safer, and maybe improve how well people stick with their therapy.
That's a really cool concept, moving from reactive to potentially predictive control based on biosignals. What's another notion sparked by this paper?
Another area is transfer learning. This study focused entirely on the knee joint.
Makes sense, it's a common joint for exoskeletons.
Sure, but spasticity often affects multiple joints, elbows, ankles, wrists. Could the RL agent trained for the knee provide a head start for controlling an exoskeleton for, say, the elbow?
You mean take the knowledge learned at the knee and apply it elsewhere?
Kind of, yeah. The agent has learned something fundamental about interacting safely with a spastic limb via torque control. Maybe you wouldn't need to train an elbow controller completely from scratch.
So you'd build a new digital twin for the elbow, but initialize the learning process using the trained knee agent.
Exactly. Fine-tune the existing agent rather than starting over. It might require significantly less training data and time. Of course, you'd need to account for the different biomechanics, the different muscle groups, and spasticity patterns at the elbow.
It wouldn't be a direct copy-paste?
No, definitely not. But if you could transfer even some of the core learning, it could dramatically speed up the development of controllers for multiple joints, maybe even leading towards more comprehensive, full-body adaptive systems faster and more efficiently.
That idea of leveraging prior learning across different tasks, or in this case, different joints, is really powerful in ML. Very interesting.
It holds a lot of promise for making these sophisticated control systems more scalable.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look at how reinforcement learning is pushing the boundaries in assistive robotics, specifically tackling the challenge of spasticity. The focus on safety through reduced interaction forces is, I think, incredibly important.
Agreed. It's a solid step towards making these powerful devices more accessible and effective for people who could really benefit from them. This blend of detailed biomechanical modeling and advanced AI learning seems like a very fruitful direction.
For listeners who want to dig deeper into the methodology and results, we've put the link to the paper in the show notes. It's definitely worth a read. And as a final thought to leave you with, as these learning-based robotic systems become more intertwined with human physiology, how might they not only assist us, but also give us fundamentally new insights into the very neuromuscular conditions they're designed to help?
That's a deep question. Using the robot as both a tool and a sensor.
Something to ponder. Thanks for tuning in to Talk Tensors.